The fall of the Roman Republic is one of the most famous stories in all of history. It is also one of the most famous stories captured in the dramas of William Shakespeare. Shakespeare, the great bard of Stratford-upon-Avon, was not a political theorist, but he had much to say about politics, or at least his plays are often situated in the domain of the political. Individual plays stand out, and we all know them: Hamlet, Richard III, Macbeth. Others are sweeping narratives connected by the vicissitudes of history that are intimately connected to politics, like the Henriade and the Roman plays, Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra. No series of dramas are more important to us than Shakespeare's Roman plays, for in the Roman plays we find a world not that dissimilar from ours, a republic of liberty, teetering between foreign threats and domestic turmoil, the want and the need to defend liberty, and the ambitions of dictatorship. The arc of history eventually consummates itself in tyranny, guised under the veils of universal empire and universal peace. But at what cost? In Shakespeare's Roman plays, the greatest dramatist of all time explores the fascinating question of the decline and fall of the Roman Republic. What makes the Roman plays unique? It is the sequential development of themes that Shakespeare is playing with on stage in those great dramas. The classics, as we know, were part and parcel of Shakespeare's being and world. The classics were also very much part of any educated person's life and world during the Elizabethan and Jacobean eras. Some of those classical names still stand out with us in the 21st century. Julius Caesar, Octavius, who we know as Augustus, Antony, Cleopatra, Brutus. Others are all but forgotten, like Coriolanus, along with so many other great classical heroes who are hailed as among the greatest men ever to have lived. This wasn't the case for Shakespeare and his contemporaries. Thus, it isn't surprising that in the classical humanist revival and milieu that he lived in, Shakespeare offers some of his most profound insights for us, reading over 400 years later. Politics, friendship, and death permeate the Roman plays. The political order, known as Rome, both in its republican form and early imperial state, are center stage in the three plays. Friendship, too, is very much a central part of these plays, most famous being the friendship turned animus of Brutus and Caesar. Death, of course, like so many of Shakespeare's great plays, come for almost all of the principal characters, except for Octavius Caesar, Augustus. Moreover, all three plays constitute a trilogy of historical tragedy, as we witness the downfall of the Roman Republic into tyranny and empire. Yet the politics of one-man domination is part of all the plays upon closer inspection. Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, Octavius. So much for the supposed republic. With this reality, we must ask the question, is there any real declination over the course of the plays? There is a three-part movement of decline. That is the cost of universal empire and peace. The triumph of tyranny comes with the dissolution of the family, as we see in Coriolanus, friendship, as we see in Julius Caesar, and love itself, as we see in Antony and Cleopatra. In this dissection and interrogation of how tyranny consummates itself, Shakespeare examines the slow decline of the spirits and institutions that tyranny corrupts before destroying altogether. In Coriolanus, The relationship of the famous savior of Rome turned infamous traitor, that relationship he has with his mother and wife, is slowly ruined in his egoistic fall towards despotism. Julius Caesar, continuing on this examination of decline, looks at the loss of friendship, principally the friendship of Brutus and Julius Caesar, and how friendship is eviscerated as tyranny begins to manifest itself and progress in the world. This further descent into tyranny ultimately realizes itself in the false promises of universal empire and universal peace, as seen in the embodiment of empire and peace, Octavius Caesar, and how this pursuit of empire and peace inevitably destroys love itself, and how love must die. So, Antony, Cleopatra, and their last trusted lieutenant, Eros, love, fade away into the dungy mud of the earth for the fantastical dream of empire to realize itself. These three plays can, of course, be read independently of each other. Independent of each other, they each stand on their own pillars of genius and insight, none perhaps more so and more famous than Julius Caesar. Yet it is my belief, in agreement with far more eminent Shakespearean scholars than myself, that the Roman plays do represent an intense trilogy taken together that is far more profitable when read in sequence. Coriolanus begins in chaos. Men enter with clubs and spears, ransacking through the streets of the city because of a grain shortage, which they blame Coriolanus for. Later, we meet Volumnia and Virgilia, united in pious prayer for Coriolanus at the trials he is facing, both in the city and against the enemies of Rome who threaten it. The scenes shift to a battlefield where Coriolanus and the Romans have won a great victory against their enemies. Coriolanus returns to Rome and is hailed a hero amid the strife. The chaos eventually subsides. A foreign enemy is thwarted. Our protagonist is welcomed as a savior. What can possibly go wrong? Chaos in the play is dialectically paired against the piety of Volumnia and Virgilia. Then there is Coriolanus, the man alone, aloof, isolated, caught between the maelstrom of public violence and the storm of the mob, as well as the loving prayers of his family members. He, though, remains alone and aloof from all, preferring instead to be the lonesome hero who is really a tyrant. The tyrant, as conceived in Coriolanus by Shakespeare, is not merely the man who refuses to learn, though this is, of course, true of Coriolanus. He is, moreover, the figure alone whose isolation breaks him away from the social fabric of his community and the loving relationships of his family. The drift into tyranny and the heart of the tyrant is in this isolation, where especially the bond of family dissolves. The tyrant acts alone. He is alone. Alone, as such, the tyrant is deprived of the love that makes human life worthwhile. Richard III is the most notable example of this slip into tyranny, which of course leads to the dissolution of all of his relationships. Moreover, what is most striking about Coriolanus and his descent into the madness of his own tyranny is the pride of his passion. Pride cometh before the fall. Pride also marks one out from the rest of the crowd and makes one most susceptible to the temptations of tyrannical lust. Pride feeds the passions, and not the passion of love, but the passion of the self, the ego, the inflated sense of the self that leads one to think himself separated from the rest, marked out for some sort of special destiny. The tyrant may be surrounded by confidants, but the tyrant ultimately has no relationships with those confidants. Not only does the pride of Coriolanus separate him from Rome, his family members, it causes a degradation, as mentioned, to his most precious relationships, his mother and wife. He shuns his mother and wife, the ultimate sin in a society where filial piety was the greatest of values and virtues, and the mark of an individual's character and worth. In rejecting his family and therefore Rome, Coriolanus turns to Rome's enemies to feed his ego and lust for revenge. Having felt that he alone can save and transform Rome, he was banished and fled to the very enemies that he defeated earlier in order to seek revenge on the very Romans, his family members, the people whom he fought so valiant for at the beginning. Here, too, is Shakespeare's assertion that tyranny is often tied to lustful passions, envy, animosity, the want for revenge. Coriolanus returns to Rome intent on destruction and is greeted by his friends and family, begging him to stop his desire for revenge and the destruction of their city. Before his eventual murder, Coriolanus gets a touching moment with Volumnia and Virgilia. If the bonds of Rome have failed to persuade Coriolanus, perhaps family can persuade him to stop his lust for revenge and destruction. Yet he rejects the bond of family. All bond and privilege of nature break. Though Coriolanus is experiencing a certain humanization in this encounter and dialectic between himself and his mother and wife and son, he fights against what they symbolize. "Tell me not wherein I seem unnatural," he cries. Not even the intervention of his mother and wife, imploring him to return to the bonds of nature, the love offered in the family, the salvation and humanization represented by the heart, can save Coriolanus. Volumnia's speech highlights the importance of family and love in preventing the slide and the slip into tyranny. In beseeching her son, she even pleads to him to make the Romans and Volscians one family, as he is uniquely positioned to do so, now a traitor who has sought union with those enemies to feed his revenge for expulsion, but remaining the Roman hero that he was his root planted in the city, the Roman citizenry, and his family. They are still looking to Coriolanus for a path to salvation, if only Coriolanus accept it. While here Coriolanus finally accepts Volumnia's impassioned plea, his rejection of the bond of family ultimately seals his fate. Even here, Coriolanus acts alone for his own desires and ego. He sees himself and not his mother, not his family members, not his countrymen in this great mission. He sees only the glory that he would win by being the peacemaker. He heads to the Volscians to make peace, but is killed as a traitor. To die a traitor is to die without a home, without a family, without the bond of love to be loyal to, without the love, without that love, without the love of a home, without the love of a family. One becomes a tyrant, unmoored and adrift, which causes one to indulge in one's own lusts and dark fantasies. The action of Coriolanus was tied to the family of Coriolanus. The next episode of Rome's Decline and Fall is tied to friendship, the friendship of Brutus and Julius Caesar, to be specific. And we know how that turns out. Brutus will betray Julius Caesar, and the revelation of a best friend's betrayal causes the utterance of those infamous words forever seared in our consciousness. Et tu, Brute? Is Julius Caesar really a tragedy about Caesar? Or is it really the tragedy of friendship, principally focused on Brutus, who is the real protagonist and the psychological main character of the play. Caesar is a tyrant. There is no romanticization of Caesar and his lust for power, or his pride. And his pride, like with Coriolanus, causes him to become alone and isolated in a world where he thought he had many friends. That Caesar is a tyrant forces Brutus's hand and heart to take action. He must forsake his friendship with the great Roman general in order to save the Republic, or so he thinks. Here, Shakespeare is offering commentary on how politics can change friendship. Prior to Caesar's foray into the domain of the political and his movement toward tyrannical rule, Brutus and Caesar could be friends and were best of friends. Caesar's entry into the domain of politics, the threat he poses to senatorial privilege, the consolidation of the monopoly of power that tyranny entails, forces the rupture of that loving friendship Caesar and Brutus had for each other prior to Caesar's march towards despotism and Brutus's acceptance of the need to be the one to destroy that friendship for the salvation of Rome. Since politics seems to be a zero-sum game revolving around power, the benignity of friendship and the warm heart of love that friendship can manifest is necessarily destroyed in politics. Politics doesn't afford the possibility for love. It is a brutal game of domination. As Max Weber would say in the 19th century, politics is not the realm of saints. To those who say Brutus never loved Caesar, a close reading of the play indicates otherwise. In the conspiracy to murder Caesar, in which Cassius seeks to enlist the aid of Brutus, Brutus initially balks. He is conflicted. "I would not, Cassius, yet I love him well," he declares. Cassius is the schemer and chief villain of the play when you examine his speeches. Cassius's villainy breaks Brutus's heart of friendship, and Brutus's various laments and psychological torment reveals as much. Since Cassius first did what me against Caesar, I have not slept. Brutus eventually succumbs to the temptations offered by Cassius and the conspirators to kill Caesar. Brutus, in succumbing to this temptation, justifies his abandonment of love in the false veils of honor, glory, and nobility. Brutus is restoring honor, glory, and nobility to Roman politics in embracing the conspiracy and planning to kill the tyrant Caesar. "Let's kill him boldly," Brutus announces, "but not wrathfully." What does that even mean? Shakespeare here seems to be uniquely exceptional in offering an inspection of the tyranny of Julius Caesar, who is himself prideful and arrogant, and the eventual acceptance of dark actions that destroy love and feed one's sense of pride through false veils of concepts of glory, honor, and nobility, represented by Brutus. Brutus does, in fact, become a butcher no matter how he attempts to justify his actions. He wrathfully kills Caesar, despite claiming his embrace that murder isn't motivated by wrath. But it is. Brutus is able to deceive himself to claim his cruel actions are somehow noble and loving. Love of Rome and the liberty that Caesar threatens is what motivates Brutus. Thus, not only does tyranny destroy friendships, tyranny causes murders and leads to tyrants to try and justify their cold and brutal actions, as is the case with Brutus, who becomes a tyrant in of himself in killing Caesar and trying to rule Rome. Thus, the Bard of Stratford-upon-Avon is simultaneously deconstructing two sides to tyranny within the play Julius Caesar. The arrogance and pride of the usual tyranny, easily identifiable, Caesar, with the sophistry of nobility, honor, and glory that Brutus comes to mask his own tyranny, his own lust for power. Brutus has become a monster, and worst, in becoming this new monster, he has forsaken the love he formerly had with Caesar, and he becomes a tyrant as well. Taken in its fullness, then, we also witness Shakespeare's commentary on how tyranny destroys the loving bond of friendship, and how the destruction of friendship is a continuation down the path to tyranny. And when Julius Caesar is read in the aftermath of Coriolanus, we also witness how tyranny has destroyed family in Coriolanus, and now has destroyed friendship in Julius Caesar. Those pillars and magnets of love which make life meaningful, family and friendship, are beginning to disappear as we move deeper and deeper into the dark abyss of tyranny. With family and friendship ruined by this fall into tyranny, love itself is the final pillar that is to be destroyed for the complete and utter totalizing consummation of tyranny to emerge in our world. That is what Antony and Cleopatra is principally about. The astute reader will know and have noticed how love is part of the examination of Coriolanus and Julius Caesar. Love in the family and love in friendship were destroyed in those two plays. With family and friendship removed, all that is left to destroy is the final edifice of life itself, love. I personally love Antony and Cleopatra. I find it to be a profound work of drama that also reveals the mature Shakespeare's thoughts on love and politics. It is one of the latest plays that Shakespeare wrote. One must forsake politics if one is to live a life of love. After all, Coriolanus, Caesar, and Brutus were all intimate participants in the domain of politics, and because of that, they had the love which sustained their hearts soiled and turned to blackness and darkness. Antony speaks an incredible truth about how love is incompatible with politics when he makes love with Cleopatra in her bedchambers. As he says, "Let Rome and Tiber melt, and the wide arch of the ranged empire fall. Here is my space. Kingdoms are clay, our dungy earth alike feeds beast as man. We stand up peerless." Antony and Cleopatra are peerless in their love. Lovers stand apart from politicians and politicos precisely because they are lovers and not politicians, those cold, lonely, almost pitiable creatures, if not for the fact that they are cruel butchers and tyrants. Moreover, Antony and Cleopatra are passionate. Their passion reveals to us their love for each other and their abdication of the sterile nature of politics. In Antony and Cleopatra, we see what the good passion is, when passion is directed to love, love of another, the love of somebody who can become a member of our family, rather than the love of self, which is prideful and egoistic and pushes one towards the steep of tyranny. Moreover, their speeches are passionate, at least when Antony is in the company of Cleopatra. For when he is in Rome, and when he is beside fellow Roman schemers, politicians, and politicos, he becomes mechanical, dry, cold, and heartless, just like them. The wisdom of the play is revealed by Antony and Cleopatra, not Octavius Caesar or any of his lackeys. That love is the central spirit governing Antony and Cleopatra is also stated in their first spoken lines. "If it be love indeed, tell me how much," Cleopatra says. Antony answers, "There's beggary in the love that can be reckoned." This love they share can offer a new heaven and a new earth. The Roman Empire, with its wide arches, cannot. Lastly, The space of play in which Antony and Cleopatra are fully themselves is the space of love. That time, O times, I laughed him out of patience, and that night I laughed him into patience, and next morn, ere the 9th hour, I drunk him to his bed. Then I put my tires and mantles on him, whilst I wore his sword. In contrast to the passionate love of Antony and Cleopatra, which offers a new heaven and a new earth, is the mechanical emptiness of Octavius Caesar and the bureaucratic empire of tyranny that he embodies and represents. He is cold and calculating, where Antony and Cleopatra are intoxicating and erotic, passionate and moving. Octavius Caesar is introduced like a bureaucrat, sitting at his desk, going through plans and papers. The depiction of Octavius as a cold tyrant is the maturation of Shakespeare's interrogation of the nature of tyranny. He never utters a single passionate line throughout the play. He never gives a passionate speech, even though he is a general at war. He is never involved in the thick of exhilarating action. Let us return to Coriolanus and Julius Caesar and Brutus ever so briefly at this moment of character contrasts. These were men of intense passion, much like Antony and Cleopatra. But their passion led them down the path of tyranny because it was focused on themselves and their ego, rather than focused on another in love, as the passion of Antony and Cleopatra is. Their egoistic passion fed their insatiable appetite for political conquest and glory. Yet the lovers of those plays were also passionate, and they always provided the path to salvation. Volumnia, Virgilia, even Brutus, prior to his fall into temptation and conspiratorial murder. What kept the passion of lovers different from the passions that befell the tyrants was relationships. Coriolanus's passion is never tied to another. It is relegated purely to himself. This is also true of that other famous tyrant, Richard III. The passion of Volumnia and Virgilia is the passion induced because of the love of family. The passion originally exemplified of Brutus was in his friendship to Julius Caesar. Again, that passion is tied to another. The passion of Antony and Cleopatra are in each other's arms and bosoms, as lovers in each other's bedchambers. The passion of the tyrants, Coriolanus and Caesar, and eventually Brutus in his turn to murder, is that their passion is contained only to themselves. It is directed only to themselves. Their passion has no great other to love, no beloved to direct the passion, no partner to tame the ego in the self-giving love of self to another. We all intuitively know what Shakespeare is telling us here. We feel it inside our very souls. Those of us who are alone, despondent, we are filled with the great negative passions that make us so frightened, so wrathful, so angry. Those who are in relationships, lying and playing in the arms and bosoms of another, are filled with the positive passions that produce joy and smiles. Where does this leave Octavius then? Tyranny has been on the march for 2 plays, hundreds of years in the Roman historical timeline, now reaching its acme in Octavius. This too reveals the genius of Shakespeare. Octavius, in the continuity of the Roman plays, represents the new, mature, formalized manifestation of tyranny in its purest, unadulterated, completed form. The early emergence of tyranny and its march to completion begins in ecstasy, passion, and ego. It is in pride. We can look to the Bolshevik Revolution as the finest example of this reality in our near historical past. The passion of the Bolshevik Revolution, the October struggle, Lenin, Trotsky, etc., is darkly inspiring despite their crimes, because of the great ecstasy and passion that was involved in it. So too is this the case when you read Coriolanus and Julius Caesar. Yet after the passionate, tyrannical beginnings comes the empty, mechanical, cold, bureaucratic totalitarianism of bureaucracy and the destruction and eradication of eros, love, from the world. Think of Stalin as the great other contrasting example. So here, in Antony and Cleopatra, Shakespeare prefigured the Bolshevik Revolution by 400 years. Octavius is a Stalin. He is a cold, empty, mechanical man who operates with lackeys who do his bidding as he sits at a desk and inside his office. He is not out in the streets, in the battlefields, in the trenches, like his tyrannical predecessors. The consummation of tyranny is the complete destruction of passion from the world. The tyrant is now walled up in his office. He operates through subordinates. Let us now turn to another Shakespearean insight that invites deep intellectual consideration concerning the fall of the Roman Republic and its descent into tyranny and empire. Love threatens the political. Let Rome and Tiber melt. Since love threatens the political, Volumnia and Virgilia's love, the love of Caesar, Brutus had before succumbing to the temptation of murder, the love of Antony and Cleopatra, the politics of tyranny and the false dream of universal peace preached by Octavius must destroy love itself for its maniacal phantasmagoria to realize itself. Thus Octavius wages his war against love and lovers. Antony and Cleopatra must die. Note here that the love of Antony and Cleopatra again prefigures a new heaven and a new earth. The consummation of political ambition per Octavius doesn't portend to a new heaven and new earth, but the dream and the lie of universal worldly peace. Note that big difference here. Love leads to a renewal of life, a new heaven and a new earth. Tyranny and its pursuit of empire, utopia, promises universal peace. How eerily prescient that statement is. How many of our own tyrants, hiding their despotism, claim their efforts will bring lasting peace to the world. As Octavius and Agrippa and their armies close in on Antony and Cleopatra, ready to deliver the killing blow to love itself, Octavius declares those haunting lines: "The time of universal peace is near." But universal peace is not passionate. The peace offered by Octavius's tyranny is bland, mechanical, empty. It is cold. The triumph of tyranny from Shakespeare's magisterial vision is empty. The world, in all its majesty, and humans in all their complexity, have vanished. How many of the great books dealing with dystopian despotism since Shakespeare also manifest that vision? Almost all. It is usually an act of erotic love, true erotic love, that threatens the dark tyranny that tyrannical dystopia represents. George Orwell's 1984 is probably the most famous example in modern times. Tyranny is cold and bleak. That is the quintessentially Shakespearean insight into politics and tyranny. At the end of Antony and Cleopatra, with the world of love crumbling before their eyes, Eros is the final lieutenant who cannot come to deliver the sword into Antony's chest. So Eros kills himself. After Eros commits suicide, which is a symbolic act in the play given the name choice of the character, Antony and Cleopatra soon die as well. With love finally dead, our lovers die. Tyranny is complete. The lonely, cold, bleak tyrant has won. What is tyranny, according to Shakespeare? Isolation, loneliness, emptiness. A world in which family, friendship, and love itself have been eradicated. And that is how Rome fell. From the Republic, built on the love of family, the love of friendship, love itself. And the birth of empire represented the destruction of all of that. We who live in a supposedly free age, without the pillars of family, friendship, and love, a feeling of isolation and loneliness, with the dark and mechanical walls of nothingness enclosing around us, may well see through the facade of modern propaganda and find something profoundly prescient in Shakespeare. We who want life want love, like Antony and Cleopatra. In lovers' arms, we experience what it really means to be human. Yet the tyrant has also lost. Antony declared that kingdoms are made of dungy clay, empty earth. The kingdoms of this world fall, but love endures. We remember great lovers precisely because love is eternal and immortal. Politics is not. How fitting, then, in Shakespeare's dissection of the march of tyranny in the Roman plays, that he leaves us with the greatest lovers of antiquity, whose love still causes our own hearts to flutter, and offers the only true escape from the politics of tyranny and the collapse of civilization. Flee! Flee from the empty promises of politics. Embrace the bedchamber of love. Be Antony and Cleopatra. Be Volumnia and Virgilia. Be Brutus in his friendship with Julius Caesar. That life of love is the only life worth living. Everything else is counterfeit and ends in tragedy. How did Rome fall, according to Shakespeare? It abandoned and destroyed love. It killed the family, it killed friendship, and then it finally destroyed love itself.